Andrew, it's so exciting to partner with you on this. I am trying to think about how many years we have had the blessing of knowing each other, but it certainly dates back to when I first became a parent, overnight to my niece and nephew while still working at the task
Before.
force. Say it again.
I said it was before. I met you before you had them. And then I remember talking to you when they were sort of still, you weren't sure and they were maybe coming. And then when your family formed. So, yeah.
Yes. What? I'm talking about you. My 9-year-old is right here, interested in who I'm talking about.
Great.
Yeah, and so Andrew was on the board of the National LGBTQ Task Force when I worked there as an organizer, and we've managed to stay connected through all of the twists and turns of our unique family building journeys. And so we're really excited to have you here as part of Family of Quality's online programming for LGBTQ plus parents, families, and kids, and those who wish to form families. To say a tiny bit about Family of Quality before we turn it over to you, we are the nation's leading nonprofit dedicated to supporting LGBTQ plus parents and those who wish to become parents. Normally, that's my job. I'm traveling the country, helping people figure out how they can build the family that they want, as well as training providers so that we don't have to educate our providers when we get there. But when the pandemic happened, I really did a really quick analysis of what the community needed and went to our CEO, Stan Sloan, and said, let me build online programs to serve our families. And he was like, that sounds great, let's do it. And so that's what we've been doing. And so everything from creative writing for teenagers to drag queen story hours, to mental health workshops for adults, how to stay connected to your partner, how to draw clear boundaries around the digital lives of our kids right now. I'm so proud of what we've been able to offer, and I'm so proud of what we're offering this evening as well. So if you don't already know, Andrew Solomon is a writer, an author, a journalist, a speaker, a dad, an activist, an organizer. And I was thinking, if you were to tell me, like, what would your fantasy life be, Tristan? I would be like, oh, I would love to meet hundreds of families different from mine and tell their stories. I would also love to travel the globe and go to places where music has been forbidden and meet queer artists who are still making art under that circumstance. And I'd love to profoundly shift the way that people think about depression and mental health. I'd love to do a TED Talk or two. Like, oh, cool. Andrew Solomon is like literally living my dream. So I'm just so excited to bring some work that you have not shared with anyone publicly from your newest book with us, which is not exclusively about the current pandemic, and yet it is also becoming a little bit about the pandemic. So I would love for you to share what you'd like to about that story and to embark upon your reading.
Good. Well, let me just say before I actually start reading that I have been working for an embarrassingly long time on a book about expanding ideas of family that deals with adoption and foster care and queer families and multi-parent families and many different kinds of families and how they're constructed and how they differ from one another. And during this pandemic, I've had to rethink the idea of family quite a lot as I've been sheltering with my son. I also have other children, but they don't live with me, and so they're sheltering in their own various places. But I'm here with my husband and my son, as you'll hear, and my husband's best friend, who's my surrogate father-in-law. And I've been trying to write about our experience. I've been writing about it in the past tense because it is my presumption and hope that by the time this is published, it will be in the past tense. At the same time, I feel like part of what one does as a writer is attempt to gain control over things over which one actually has no control at all. And I think putting it in the past tense gives me a sense that I have the right to try to put it in some kind of order. So I'm going to read for about 15 or 20 minutes from what I've done, and then I'll take questions of any kind from anyone, and I'll be happy to tell you about this book or about the books I've already written or about anything else that that floats your boat. So here is from the first draft, and this is, as Tristan said, the first time I've shared anything from this book publicly, and this is very recent. I've just written this over the last 2 weeks, but this is an excerpt from the conclusion to the book. I've called it On Bouncing. The COVID isolation was in many ways a testing ground for modern ideas of family. We were all forced into a contained group, even more nuclear than that dictated by mid-century aspirations to live out Leave It to Beaver. No matter how much you adored your spouse and children, the prospect of seeing no one but them for an indefinite period was traumatic. I count us as fortunate in that we had and liked one another. My husband, John, our son, George, and my surrogate father-in-law, Dean. We were all sheltered in our place upstate in Rhinebeck, which was in some ways not outfitted for permanent occupation, and so we did a lot of adapting. If there had been no language for the relationships we had had to one another before, there were surely no words for this new intensity. We embarked on shared isolation for an indefinite period, keeping George away from all his friends, who were also being kept away from him. He was too old for us to be dishonest about what was happening in the world. He had internet access, and he did considerable reading. He knew that an acquaintance of mine had died the first week, others after that, close friends too, that such losses were never merely abstract. He acknowledged being frightened in the first days, but then shifted to a kind of diffident way of deflecting his anxieties through eagerly seeking out the comedy in everything, including the hilarity he perceived, being 10, in annoying the adults around him. George was having a much rougher time than he would allow us to see. Was he protecting himself? Was he protecting us? Was it simple pride? He was cheerful almost all the time, sometimes uncannily so. He became very physical with John and me. That is not to say that he wanted hugs and kisses. Every night after dinner, the four of us watched a movie together. Dean is an aficionado of film and helped with some of the choosing. George wanted films with action or physical comedy, and we had hits with the Harry Potter films, which we hadn't allowed him to watch until we finished reading the books together at bedtime, an enterprise that had taken the better part of a pre-COVID year. Even during the films he loved, George had a habit of interrupting in the middle of scenes the rest of us found moving or exciting to ask whether he could get another ice cream sandwich. He liked the films, but more so the ritual. While we watched, John and George and I would sit in a row on an old green velvet sofa that had once been in my father's office, and Dean would sit in a leather club chair beside us. George remained in constant physical contact with John and me. He sat on our laps. He wedged himself so that his feet rested on one person's shoulders and his head on the other's. Sometimes he would crawl over the back of the sofa and twine his arms around my neck or John's. He would insist on sitting on top of one or the other of us, sometimes obscuring our view of the screen. He particularly liked to get me to stretch my legs out and rest them on an ottoman so that he could sit on my suspended knees, an exercise that frequently overflowed into joint pain for me. I tried not to complain, though, because I found the physicality as reassuring as he did. It reminded me of my childhood and of that long-term feeling that my parents were physical manifestations of a safe world, that as long as I was with them both, no real harm could come to me. I remembered that comfort, and I found that I wanted it terribly, but was now expected instead to provide it. I took all George's physical clinginess to be a kind of regression, and I understood that people regress when they are anxious. I think if someone had offered me the chance to be with my husband and son full time for a set length of time, whatever length of time it was, I would have leaped at the opportunity. In the life I had led before the virus, I had always bemoaned the myriad obligations that took me away from both my family and my work. You love your children, your partner, and your parents differently from how you love your friends. I had always been annoyed by that famous line of Robert Frost's, "Home is the place where, when you have to go there, they have to take you in." It always sounded to me like grudging praise of familiar architecture. Family is what takes you in, not just because they have to, but because ultimately they recognize you. Family is the secret society that rules the island where you find yourself run aground. The absence of an end date was terrifying. If I had known we had to shelter in place until August 11th, but not after that, I'd have made a sort of advent calendar with George and crossed off the days with delight. One wants a beginning, a middle, and an end. And we didn't know where along that spectrum we fell. There seemed to be nothing but middle after the first 4 days or so. George was 10 when we went into hiding. By the time a vaccine was expected, he would be nearly 12. He would be someone else, and permanently marked by the aspects of maturation of which he'd been deprived by the circumstance of confinement. I didn't know how to make up for what he was missing. Evidence shows that people who smile more are happier, that the physical activity of lifting the corners of your mouth engenders the mood it appears merely to represent. George's neediness forced merriment upon us, where I might once have said to George, "I'm a bit sad tonight." The threat of sadness sweeping in like a tsunami and carrying us all away meant that the basic good humor had to continue willy-nilly. There had to be stories and bedtime and also breakfast. Mercifully, John did breakfast. And confidences were shared very conditionally and with a kind of determined sprightliness. I whistled a lot of happy tunes, both literally and metaphorically. Being forced to deny depression can be a dangerous social tyranny, but choosing to vanquish all outward signs of it for the benefit of someone more vulnerable pulled me back from the brink time and again. I had always thought that the anguish of family relations was all vested in death, loss, departure. But there with John and George and Dean in our Rhinebeck idyll, I understood that the pain was consuming helplessness. The isolation reified the impotence we all feel, the anguish of not being able to make the world safe for our children. I loved every night that I lay in the dark on George's right side, John piled up on the left, giving him a sense of security, but I loathed knowing that it was a false sense of security. I hated that there was brittleness in George that I couldn't ameliorate except by pretending it wasn't there. Lying in that bed in the dark next to his slumbering form, I felt fraudulent. The virus was out there, and I couldn't make it go away. It was tough to be a reef, constantly breaking threatening waves of reality down into gentler undulations of perception. George's friendships had become symbolic because the friendships of boys in particular require corporeal presence, and the electronic attachments that the fifth graders were sustaining couldn't be more than approximations of closeness. Fifth grade boys don't share their innermost vulnerabilities over the internet or by phone. Their intimacy is predicated on shared reactions, and trending video games they could play together are different from the back and forth children sustain in person. Even their oldest friendships, those that dated back 5.5 years to the beginning of kindergarten, were always new because the boys were maturing so fast and their interests and personalities were in constant flux. George was one of the younger among the children in his class, and that magnified his developmental fluidity. He often seemed more grown up one day than he had the day before. How much did this changing character show on Zoom for French class, which was where he actually saw his friends? The perception of having good friends was immensely important to George, and it was true. Many other children liked him, and he liked them. But there was a void where some of the substance of those friendships belonged. I never intended to be everything to my children. Now, however, There was no one else to be anything to George. We had become his whole story, and he was in many ways mine. George said one day soon after his birthday, "I'm homesick." He said that he missed our room and the people who lived next door, and even the nice man at the cheese counter at our local grocer. It was not so much the unfamiliarity of our life in Rhinebeck, but the loss of another familiarity. So we gradually constructed our new normal. I had been cynical about norms, had deconstructed the concept of normal, had felt pleasantly and even thrillingly above the idea. We were extraordinary. We were nearly unique. In coming out as gay, I had seized the opportunity to be entirely free. Now, like all parents, I hoped to save my children from my own bygone anguish, and therefore wanted George to grow up thinking anything was possible. Of course, I had always wanted him to do well at school, to take a shower every day. I didn't always win that one, and to be polite. Our lives were extremely regulated and well woven in with social diktats. But at some meta level, I wanted him to roam at liberty. In quarantine, the structuring regulations of ordinary life were confiscated, and we had to build habits from scratch. At first, it seemed kind to indulge George to the point of his running feral, but it soon became clear that the less we controlled his life, the less controlled his life became, and that was not what he wanted. Children need structure, and it was up to us to provide it, and we had to make the structure as normal as possible. George and I went every afternoon at 5 to the trampoline, where he proposed that both of us bounce simultaneously while holding each other's arms at the shoulder. He called it dancing, which it probably was. He also invented a more aggressive game called Boop, in which we tried while bouncing to poke each other in the belly. And then we came up with Russian dancing, in which we crossed our arms over our chests and tried to kick out our legs as we jumped, often caroming into each other. His favorite was a rehash of the swimming pool game Marco Polo, in which one of us would close his eyes and try to find the other. Some days, we tried to videotape our antics and laughed at how ridiculous we looked on video. George mastered doing an airborne flip like one of the flying Wallendas, while I floundered with mild vertigo and a stiff back, feeling altogether less like an Olympic gymnast than like a ludicrous jack-in-the-box. I sometimes felt I couldn't bear the sweetness of this time. It was a strangely double life, so calm and lovely on its surface, so desperate in its cause, and it was often hard to see both these realities at once. I'd forget for a while that the way we were living was a consequence of disaster. And I think that it was a time George and John and I would remember fondly all our lives. It's not COVID. Would remember fondly all our lives, this intense togetherness, this all day, everyday attention. I suppose that when I got to my old age, I would recall laughing on that trampoline, standing on its wobbly edge to call for the dog when she wandered away, uninspired by our calisthenic hops and dives. I'd yearn for the way George said, "Bounce, come on, bounce," every time I stopped to catch my breath. The idea of trampoline time was that George needed at least this much exercise. But the reality of it was that I too needed the exercise, and that I too needed a break from looking at a screen, and that I too was nourished by 45 minutes of laughter. And yet we were all aware, even George, that these rituals were contingent on the disease being out there and on our not having it. If either of those things changed, we'd have to move on. It is fulfilling to shield your family from danger, but it is nicer when the danger goes away. I both loved this tenderness and prayed that it would end while we still had an intact other life to return to. People I knew marginally and the parents of friends kept dying, day by day. How could everything be at once so enthralling and so bleak? And how was it changing us? Like caterpillars who spin themselves into a cocoon, we were being transformed. But the slug is an incompetent lepidopterist, and we could not guess whether we'd come out as moths or as butterflies. John and I were in constant dispute about how serious the COVID situation really was. John is not rash, but he's much less cautious than I am about worldly danger. He sometimes seemed to believe that acknowledging the seriousness of the problem was a way of giving in, that what was needed was courage and an energetic response of resistance. The tendency to think that way has served him well in human crises, and it allowed him to protest that he was enjoying our isolation without the shadow of fear. But this crisis was to do with a physical menace that lolled around on plastic bottles and metal shelves, and bravado wasn't going to do the trick. To get him to conform to certain basic safety measures, I had to exaggerate how serious I thought each bit of danger was. Meanwhile, I had to downplay how serious the situation was in my interactions with George. This overplaying, underplaying process was pretty exhausting and was hard to maintain when we were all together. The balance I achieved seemed to be adequate, but I was not keen on the idea of keeping it up indefinitely. In the context of all that, I was still a gay dad. I have asserted that various experiences of family are different, that we have been dishonest in proposing that they are not only equal but also equivalent. Now I felt a great deal more equivalent, because in good times the distinctions had mattered more than anything, and in savage times the way we were all the same were essential. Every person who loves any other person does so in his or her own way. But there are also wholesale universals buried in love, and we were as much subject to them as any other family. George inhabited an unsafe world, and John and I pantomimed safety for him. We modeled civic values and expressed our personal politics and helped him to love us unashamed. But in the end, we were merely packing materials, the bubble wrap around his burgeoning self. Coronavirus made me want to throw out the very notion of diversity. It made me feel that there was no such thing. I was challenged by the smaller, resolute assurance required to prevent our aloneness from turning into loneliness. I had to keep freshness too with John, whom I had been with for nearly 20 years. New love is exciting. Old love is reassuring. We needed both to drive out the risk of staleness between us when we had so few distractions, and to ensure that we saw each other even when we were preoccupied with our child. John's Midwesterness can surface when I least expect it. He pours himself a strong cocktail and lapses into gruff silence, unless there is something concrete to say. Expressive though he fundamentally is, he can nonetheless sit through dinner without saying a word. I tend toward an endlessly detailed unspooling of the sometimes dubious connections between my external life, what I did today, and my internal one, what I felt today. When you live in the vicinity of disaster, you take such measures as you can to forestall it, and then you determine a stance. John had railed for years about the threat of climate change, and even about the possibility of a pandemic. But in the face of this threat born into reality, he lived in a state of irritable but casual resignation. The things we did do seemed talismanic. Disinfecting all our packages felt like knocking on wood or crossing my fingers. The idea of soaking our vegetables in Tide or Clorox felt like lighting candles in churches that did not represent my faith. Quaint, touching, but ultimately meaningless. I had to remind myself that there was a real physical virus, and that whether we died of it had to do with more than luck. We argued. I thought George should be in bed by 10 o'clock. John got absorbed in whatever movie we were watching and wanted to see it through, as did George, and often Dean. So I got shouted down a good bit, then got so annoyed and frustrated that I insisted, and often won, but at the cost of setting us all on edge. John would work all day on making a really delicious dinner assisted by George, then get angry that George had not set the table, and that argument could shadow our eating of the lamb tagine that had taken John 6 hours to prepare. George would climb on me and wedge his knee into my groin and his elbow into my eye at the same time. And then I'd ask why he couldn't just sit still and watch the movie. And he would ask why everyone was always yelling at him. Intimacy is often pondered as a pillowy condition, but it is in fact sharp and rasping, and I often felt chafed by it. Some of what would have been true if one of us had the virus was true even without it. We had the intimacy that only tragedy can produce. It was hard to revel in this because we'd all have preferred lives in which we depended on more people and more activities and more distractions. But family is precisely this, a rejection of the world and its gravity in favor of some internal magnetism. We knew that for the rest of his life, George would think back on that strange time when we had had only one another and had tried to make the days interesting by putting jalapenos in dishes where they usually don't belong. Sometimes I thought it just resembled a long family trip to a country where no one else spoke our language. We'd done those with George every year. But there, we had organized our intimacy and shared wonder at ancient ruins, or a chapel carved from salt, or even a stretch of impeccable beach. It was just us now. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. A couple of people said, you know, how you did manage to capture things that felt very similar to what they're going through. And I think, you know, I feel the same way. It's like, how many times is it, like, why do you have to be literally on my body right now? And like, I know intellectually, but when I'm already also freaked out about the world, I don't also need to have you literally like this.
Exactly.
Yes, yes. And so this is part of, or planning to be part of, a different book. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the book, I said a few words about it at the beginning, but I'll say a few more words about it now. It's a book, it's in the same structure as my book, Far from the Tree, that came out in 2012. And that book was about how ordinary families dealt with having extraordinary children. And this book is about extraordinary families. So it includes chapters on divorce and step families, interfaith and interracial families, adoption, foster care, single parenthood, assisted reproduction, queer families of various kinds, and multi-parent families, paid childcare, and the so-called child-free family. There we are. I did all 10 in order. And
Amazing.
the concept of it, I mean, it's going to be a big, sprawling book, but the concept of it is that over the last 50 years, our understanding of family has gone through a really radical transformation. And while in most areas where there's been a radical transformation, like the use in day-to-day life of computers, we've had a great surge of new vocabulary. And we still have in the English language 13 words for relatedness: mother, father, sister, brother, aunt, uncle, cousin, and so on, with various prefixes and suffixes added to them. And so we're constantly pushed into trying to approximate the mainstream family. You know, people will sort of say about my son's surrogate, So she's sort of like an aunt. And I'll say, no, she's sort of like my son's surrogate. And people will say, who's a good friend of ours? And people sort of say, but so does that, I mean, in a way, is she sort of his mother? And I say, no, she's not his mother, but she is his surrogate. I mean, I just find myself endlessly having to do that. And so my argument is that we cheat ourselves of a very beautiful and precious richness that is in fact come from this expanding idea of family. And that the people who are opposed to diversity in family are in many instances expressing that opposition in highly energized ways by constantly saying, are you as good as a sort of so-called mainstream family? And I have to say over and over again in those circumstances, the question of whether we're as good as, yes, I think many forms of family can work and many forms of family can fail. The question of whether we're as good as poses that somehow these mainstream families represent an ideal and that we all have to measure ourselves against them. And we then, in arguing for equality, end up saying we're all exactly the same. And I don't think we are all exactly the same. I think there are things that are different in the experience of my family from the experience of a mainstream straight family. I think there are things that are probably easier. There are things that are probably harder. There are things we stand to give that are just specific. It's not better or worse. So I've really tried to explore that. And then in the quarantine, as you heard in the piece, I felt very much as though my sense of what family is has been narrowed by the lack of contact with anyone else, really, or any other families. I mean, aside from trying to Zoom and so on with people. And so I've been exploring what does it mean after I have a whole book which I should add is very much not yet written, but a whole book that is about these ideas of diversity. What does it mean at the end of it to say, okay, the diversity is great, but actually we end up inventing family, each of us ourselves. And that's a process that is in some ways universal, whether you're in a so-called diverse family or not. So that's the book I'm working on, and that's where this fits in.
Yeah, and it's always, I think, fascinating to hear how kids themselves then process through and explain things. Before the pandemic, obviously, I used to love to, I'd say eavesdrop, but like accidentally overhear my kids talking to other kids about their family. And often, our adopted kids have a younger biological sister who lives with my partner's parents. So she lives with her grandparents, but they all live in Portland, and she used to come over to our house one night a week and then one weekend a month. And so they spend a fair amount of time together, and they all go to school in the same school. And so often people would say, so then who is that? And they're like, well, she's like kind of our sister, but kind of our cousin, but also kind of our aunt. She's 6. And so it's always fascinating too to think about these convoluted ideas we have and then watch them just distill themselves all the way down to the most simplest and pure forms, which is how our children choose to describe these complicated relationships. And so, yeah, I always think that's so fascinating.
Someone came to dinner a while ago at our house and said to me, I'm sure there's a term for this, but I just wanted to say that it was delightful talking to the daughter of the partner of the mother of your daughter. And I said, yes. I said, Leslie, she's delightful. Yep. I said, sadly, there is no other term, but I know just who you mean.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Well, we did have several people ask questions about, because you have spoken at great length publicly about mental health. And, people are asking things like, what is it like to, for them, they're struggling with depression. And then the overlay of everything that's happening means, where does your attention span go? This person said that they actually tried to read an article, how to deal with your lack of concentration, but couldn't get through the article. And so as we think about these invisible pressures that are coming down on us and the bizarre ways they manifest themselves, how have you been sort of managing some of those things?
Well, I think that there are essentially 4 ways of responding to the current crisis. There are some people who have very robust mental health and who seem to be just fine and are kind of getting along okay. There are a lot of people who are feeling on edge and very antsy and kind of concerned, and they need some basic psychiatric first aid, and they need to regulate their eating and sleeping and exercise and so on and so forth, and not to watch the news more than an hour or so a day, and they can pull it together. Then there are the people who have never had depression or clinical anxiety, who are being pushed by the trauma of these circumstances into the experience of serious mental illness. And then finally, there are the many of us, right? The many of us who already suffered from anxiety or depression, who now, faced with the stresses of this situation, are having what gets called a double depression, in which your underlying depression is now terribly exacerbated by external circumstances. There frequently have been conversations about anxiety and depression, which are most readily recognized when they seem out of keeping with one's reality. You know, there was a period when I was so anxious I couldn't get out of bed, and my life really wasn't so bad, and there wasn't anything so scary about it. And so I thought, oh, I clearly have some sort of, I mean, it took me a while, but I thought, oh, I have a psychiatric disorder and I'd better deal with it. Now, the situation is really tense and difficult. And if people feel anxious and depressed, a lot of the time, the anxious and depressed people are going to feel like how I feel is just proportionate to what's going on. But there's a difference between recognizing that it's terrifying, that any of us could get sick, that people we love may very well die, and so on and so forth, that isolation is hard, and the point where it crosses over into a clinical condition that requires address and treatment. And I think one of the distinctions is that when you're just having moderate, realistic point of view, you can say, this is kind of terrible and not what I would have wanted. And then when you start feeling like it's never going to be fixed, it's never going to be right, I'm never going to get back to anything, when you reach the point at which you're sort of challenging your basic ability to function in life and you feel totally paralyzed, that's the point when it's crossed over into being something really problematical and when you have to sit up and pay attention. And the good news is that depression is, on the one hand, extremely common, and on the other hand, extremely treatable. And there is no reason why people who have depression shouldn't be able, even in this weird time when you can't see people in person, to access online mental health care, to get medication if medication is indicated, to get therapy if therapy will help. But it's also important that people forgive themselves. If you're feeling depressed and anxious now, don't think it's because you're weak. Don't think it's because you're not coping well. Don't think it's because you never should have had children in the first place. Recognize that everyone is under terrible, terrible stress, and that terrible, terrible stress functions biologically to break down a lot of the mechanisms through which you would wish to deal with it.
I know that I've always thought of myself as someone who thrives in a time of crisis. Like, I'm the one that comes in and does the CPR, not physically because I'm not a medical provider, but we talked a little bit before we started about what it was like to work on campaigns. And I worked on 10 years worth almost of LGBT campaigns where it felt like our lives were on the line. I do well in that crisis. And then this happened and I was just like completely useless. And my whole story about myself as someone who thrives in chaos and uncertainty had to totally change. Whereas my partner, who has dealt with much more stressful circumstances throughout his life, was like, this is fine. It's just another thing where there's uncertainty, where there's fear. And it's been interesting to see who has the resiliency and who doesn't. And I was like, oh, I don't at all. Okay.
But next time, maybe you will. I mean, I think there's the assumption. I remember having the same feeling at 9/11. I was someone who had reported internationally. I had deliberately gone into war zones. In fact, I was to travel to Afghanistan during the American invasion a few months later. I went to Afghanistan and I dealt with it fine. 9/11 happened and I pulled down all of the shades and closed all of the curtains and stayed in bed for a week. It was a physical assault on my city that I was unprepared for. So I think it varies from occasion to occasion. That there are things that particularly get some people that don't get others. There isn't a kind of, by and large, I mean, unless you're talking about, I don't know, Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt, there aren't people who are just resilient. And of course, Churchill was a depressive too. There aren't people who are just resilient. And I don't think there are people who are just completely unresilient. I think each of us has our moments, and the difficulty is figuring out where they are and figuring out a way to get through the moment when you aren't feeling adequately resilient. And this is the Family Equality Council, and I feel like, okay, it's hard to deal with not being resilient for yourself, but when your children require at least the appearance of resilience, that can be very overwhelming, and it can be a completely intolerable demand. And it's great that you are able to share that piece of it, at least, with Biff, and to have somebody there who was coping well. Some cases, both parents are really struggling. They need to support each other where they can. And in many cases, of course, there aren't two parents involved, or there aren't two parents in the house. And it's a balancing act. And If we manage to stay alive and come out at the other end of this, having gotten through it without going completely to pieces and without having destroyed one another, that's pretty good. The idea that you have to be sort of a model of shining, we're dealing with everything, we're dealing with it beautifully, I'm making 4-course dinners, the children are all tucked in bed at the exact right time, just let go of that. Just let go of it.
Well, so someone is asking actually more about, you said, is it your surrogate father or the sort of like, is there another generation in your home besides you and your children? And what is that like?
So my husband's best friend is 85 years old, much older than my husband. He is an only child. He's a gay man who never formed a lasting partnership. And so he had been on his own for much of his life in various ways. And some years ago, John said, Dean's health is not perfect and he's really having some difficulties. And I think we should invite him to come and live with us. So Dean moved in 6 years ago, I think now, something like that, and has been a sort of surrogate grandfather to George, and is very attached to him. And George calls him Bon Papa. Dean is a sort of francophile, and that seemed like a good word that wasn't the same as grandpa, which is my dad. And so we've had Dean with us for a long time. And when we decided to go into quarantine out of town, we asked Dean to come with us. And he has congestive heart failure and he has COPD. And so his respiratory health is not great. And it's very clear to me, or it seems very likely to me, that should he contract COVID, he won't last very long with it. And so we wanted to get him someplace where we could keep him as safe as we could. And it's actually been, I think, lovely for him because though we spend time together in the city, we're also all busy. And I don't think that we have the day-to-day life that we have here that's proved so valuable. And very nice for us to have someone other than just the sort of tiny unit that is the three of us, John, George, and me, and to have Dean there and to listen to the stories he has to tell and so on and so forth. So yes, we're effectively 3 generations, though Dean is not biologically related to us, but who's about biological family in this group?
Yeah, that's right. Well, one question that I also thought about is because you do have children that are not your children, or your children who are not your children. You have people that you are related to that are beloved to you that you are not a primary parent for, and you're away from them and you cannot be near them physically. And there are actually several questions, including someone who was interviewed by you for your book, who has a son who's struggling with their mental health and how to support people that you cannot be physically with. I'm wondering, how are you interacting with your extended family all over the country, and how might others be supporting the people that they love that they cannot be near?
Well, I would say, just to give anyone who doesn't know a picture of my family, my husband is the biological father of 2 children with some lesbian friends in Minneapolis. My best friend from college and I decided to have a child, and so I have a daughter who lives with her mother and her mother's partner in Texas. And then John and I have George, who's with us all the time. So my kind of tagline has been 6 parents of 4 children in 3 states. I've spent a lot of time talking to my daughter in Texas. We communicate almost every day. I talk to her mom all the time. We discuss all of what's going on. The quarantine in Texas is slightly less repressive than the quarantine in New York, so she's having a slightly easier time in some ways. But, it's a big adjustment and there's a lot to talk about and a lot to figure out. The Minneapolis family we love and adore, but both parents are working in essential areas and they're working unbelievably hard. Tammy, who's one of the moms, works in for a health insurer, and so she's dealing with health stuff all the time. And Laura is an incredibly talented photographer, but her day job is working in a grocery store. And so she's helping with that and needs to be there all the time, and particularly helps elderly or infirm people who need help getting their groceries together. So they're kind of completely frazzled. So we have less contact with that family, but we also did FaceTime when it was George's birthday about 10 days ago, and we email back and forth, and I'm doing my best to keep an eye on them. You know, I sort of wish we were all together. I'm sure we would all be driving one another crazy in some ways, but the idea that I can't actually plan to fly out next week and go to Texas or go to Minneapolis or go any place really, you know, it's very difficult to be in that kind of separation, and it saddens me a lot. And I feel like you never really know how it feels. What does the quarantine feel like for someone else? It's hard to know unless you're in their house, and I'm not in those other houses. And you know, I just read a whole passage about George. I had edited it down from something longer I've written, in which there are more references to Blaine and to Oliver and to Lucy. Um, but but even so, the experience I'm having at this quarantine is with George, and to some degree it isn't with the other children. And that too, you know, inflects it with a sort of loneliness.
Yeah, I think it was literally just yesterday. It just hit me really out of nowhere how much I miss my parents. And they live like 6 hour drive basically up in Canada, but a few times a year we would take the drive and we would go up and see them. And so yeah, and I just was like, oh my God, I really miss them. I didn't think that it was important that I went to see them as often as we do. And now I'm like, oh, that really matters to me.
Yes.
And so that's
My
been,
own father, my own father is in quarantine about an hour away, and a little more than that. And I have been trying to go and see him once every 10 days or 2 weeks. We sit 10 feet apart and we have a conversation. It feels possibly risky for me and possibly risky for him, but it also seems terribly, terribly important that we have that sustained thing. And I really do feel that the nature, we talk on the phone every day, but I feel like the nature of our relationship is defined as much by that actual time we spend together as it is by the phone conversation, and it makes it categorically different from my relationship with anyone else outside our household.
that's right. Yeah. Now, one thing that you said just really, really struck me, and it was this idea of us sort of being in a cocoon, and that we don't know if we will be a moth or a butterfly at the end of this, which I love, because I feel like I won't speak for anyone else, but I'm frantically scrambling about for what does this look like at the end, right? And of course, my therapist friend is like, what if you took all that energy and focused on being better at living in the mystery? Because that's a skill that's going to serve you forever. I was like, cool. How do I do that? Um, but I'm wondering, do you think we have any control over whether we come out of this, each one of us individually and maybe also collectively as a world? What can we be doing now that can impact whether we come out as plain as we went in, or something completely transformed and more powerful and beautiful and interconnected than before?
Well, I'm always hesitant to say that the answer is some kind of great search for meaning, because some people are able to access a search for meaning and some people aren't able to access a search for meaning. And I don't want the people who find that more difficult to feel as though they're being disparate. Having said that, I think seeking for meaning is always helpful. Um, I feel like part of how I'm keeping going is by doing the writing some of which you just heard, by trying to capture what's going on in this moment so that it'll be preserved for when we're outside this moment. And some of it has to do with the kind of ambiguities that I was exploring in what I read, of saying, you know, this is a time of such tremendous intimacy with John and George. And even though we would all opt for it to end tomorrow, we're also growing closer as a consequence of it. And I think even for people who are in isolation alone, quarantining by themselves, possibly in apartments that they never expected just do more than sleep in, I think even for those people, there is time for reflection and time for pondering your inner self, and time for assessing who the people are you can connect to in whatever way you connect, by email or telephone or Skype or whatever it is that you are using. I think it's a time to figure out what actually matters to you, what you really miss, and what was actually kind of accessory and not important in the first place, and to try to come out of this with greater, if nothing else, with greater clarity. But I say that again with the awareness that there are some people who are sinking into catastrophic depression during this. I get a lot of letters from people who are sinking into catastrophic depression during this, so I know how widespread it is, and I don't want those people to think that if they aren't finding, that they're growing as people through the process, I don't want them to feel bad about it.
Yeah, and I mean, for me, when I have personally felt profoundly insulted by the cutesy poetry that people are posting that are like, and the people listened and the earth grew. And I'm like, I don't have time for any of that. Like, I'm barely trying to hold it together, working, sun up to well past sundown, trying to keep my family safe and happy, trying to manage all these complicated dynamics that I'm like, oh, who is doing this? And I still want to believe that maybe there's some part of it that we can do something, I guess, to come out stronger on the other end. And that actually ties into, I think, the final question I had for you is, I don't remember what year did you come out?
Well, I'm not sure that I came out in a sort of single instance that can be pinpointed, but I would say I basically came out when I moved in with my first boyfriend when I was 23 years old, which would have been 1986. So, it's an extended process, but that was the nexus of it.
Certainly. And I think, I have been thinking a lot about, the generation above me of gay men and the AIDS crisis. And what did we learn from living in that fear and that anxiety and that uncertainty? And I think that actually, in some ways, answers the question about the moth versus butterfly, because I think when the people that I know, I think some emerged profoundly harmed by the lack of support they got, and probably profoundly jaded about the world, while others emerged feeling profoundly connected to other people. They were able to, as the look for the helpers, but they were able to see the way in which a community was strong and brave and resilient. It used all the power that it had, and some it didn't have, to shift the course of the illness forever. And so I wonder if you have anything to say about what the AIDS epidemic can teach us today about how to survive and how to be resilient.
I've thought a lot about the AIDS epidemic through this entire process, and I think the primary difference is that affected what was certainly seen at the time, and probably still is seen as a relatively marginal group of people. Gay world, gay men were the people it was affecting, and the larger society was rather uninterested. And then there was the extraordinary, breakthrough of ACT UP. I mean, you talked about power, and I feel like power was unleashed. In this instance, this is affecting everyone, and so that's very, very different. But part of the reason that the AIDS crisis burgeoned and grew the way it did was because we had, at the time, Ronald Reagan as our president. He's been much lauded. The airport has been named after him. People say he ended the Cold War. Ronald Reagan was a nightmare in relation to marginalized populations of all kinds, and particularly to the gay community. And it took years after the crisis began before he even said the word AIDS. And now we are living with a buffoon in the White House whose policies and statements on the topic of this crisis have led to the deaths of tens of thousands of people who didn't need to die, and who continues to think that what's going on is a sort of occasion for him further to forward his electioneering rather than an occasion for compassion, for judgment, for clarity. And I feel like ACT UP was part of what ultimately unseated the wave of conservatism that there was around at the time of the crisis, the AIDS crisis. And my hope is that there will come to be an activism around this crisis that will not only unseat Donald Trump in the immediate short term in November's election, but that will also serve ultimately to make people rethink a kind of ignorant conservatism that has painfully taken over our country and poisoned us all.
Well, I can't think of a better note to end on. And we did not get to everyone's questions. I'm so sorry. There are just beautiful things that y'all wanted to know more about, and I would love to keep talking. Unfortunately, we are at the end of our time. And I just really want to encourage everyone to support Andrew's beautiful work, buy his books, go to his website. He is still looking for more people like Michelle, who's joining us, to interview for this story. So if you have a unique family building story, you can share that with him through his website. And that if you want the email address directly, it's andrew@andrewsolomon.com. His website is andrewsolomon.com. And please do keep coming to the family equality events that we're offering. We are doing a Gay Dads meetup in 2 days. We're doing a family building workshop tomorrow. We're doing a kids workshop on meditation and mindfulness for ages 9 to 12 on Friday. In addition to our story hour we're doing for little kids in the morning. So we're doing our best to really bring community and connection and joy in the face of what all of us are living through right now. So thank you so much, Andrew. And also, I've been greatly begged to add to support our work so we can keep doing this. Please do go to familyequality.org and make a contribution if you are able to and you feel so moved. We really appreciate your support. And we've been building this work from scratch with no one could have thought to ask for a sponsorship for a pandemic 6 months ago. And so we're just doing this work as a labor of love right now. And we want to keep it going and keep bringing beautiful events like this one with Andrew to our platform. So thank you so much, Andrew. Thank you to Anna, who none of you can see, but who has been making sure the tech things work smoothly. And to all of you for being with us this evening. Have a wonderful rest of your week.
And thanks to you, Tristan, and thanks to you, Tristan, and thanks to Family Equality. It's a fantastic organization. I'm thrilled to be part of this.
Great, thank you. Good night, everyone.
Good night.